you could turn, please, to the second chapter of the book of Esther. The second chapter of the book of Esther. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young maidens unto Shushan the palace, into the house of the women, unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women. And let their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen, instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegi, that Esther was brought also into the king's house, to the custody of Hegi, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not showed her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the woman's house, to know how Esther did, and what should become of her. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into the king, Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications, accompanied to it 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odours, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shahazgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she was called by name. Now in the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegi, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favour in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken into the king Ahasuerus, into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favour in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces, and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. I don't know about you, but there are certain ladies in the Bible where they're, shall we say, have a very attractive personality. We think of Ruth and Esther and Abigail, for example. And here were women who lived in difficult times, and there was no complaining. They were hard workers. They got on with the situation that they were in with, and God blessed them. Now, Ruth, it's very clear, was a godly woman. Esther, we'll find, there's nothing said about her at all that would give us any confidence that she was godly, which is maybe quite a surprise. But you know, this chapter is 4 years later from chapter 1. Now, we don't find out in the Bible what was happening then, but we do find out in secular history that Ahasuerus had a very unfruitful war against Greece, and his navy and his army were absolutely trashed, as we would say. And he came back to Shushan a chastened man. So that explains the time difference. Vashti had been put away, and if we look at the first verse, he remembered Vashti. I think it's important that the queen hadn't just got to be a beauty queen. She had to be a companion of the king, someone he could trust, someone that he could discuss things with. And Vashti, as far as we know, was actually the mother of the next king, who was born in the year of chapter 1. So he thought on Vashti. And as we'll find out later in the book, the king found a way around one of his silly edicts, as he keeps making these silly edicts. And he found a way round one then, but his servants were worried. If he found a way to get Vashti back, she would soon find out it was their advice that had caused her to be thrown away. So they were obviously against that, and they make this suggestion to him that he gets a lot of fair young virgins. And what is interesting as you read this book, these men knew the king's character. They knew what the king liked and what he wanted, and they knew that it was in their best interests to give him exactly what he wanted, and they knew that young ladies were something that he liked. So he was quite pleased with this idea. So his first silly edict had cost him his beloved queen, and the next one we'll come to later on some of the consequences of that, which I think we find abhorrent today. So the king sent more letters out, and what is interesting is that Persia seems to be the very first empire that had its own royal mail, shall we say, and they were able to transfer letters all over the kingdom. In the first edict, it was telling the women how to behave with their husbands and not be like Vashti. I often wonder what the result of this letter was. Would some of the young maidens think, oh, this is a great opportunity. I might be the next queen, not realizing that there would be tremendous consequences if they weren't. Or could some of them regret having been born beautiful because that was the only thing that was required, and they might have regretted it at a later date? Or did some of them just maybe marry the first person they could so that they could miss this call? We just don't know. But what we do know is that according to one of the historians, there were 400 young girls brought in various tranches, as we would say, to King Ahasuerus. So anyway, Hegi, the king's chamberlain, was the keeper of the women. And again, looking at it, I think he knew the kind of person that the king wanted. And what we find is that the maiden pleased him. And again, Esther obtained favour in the sight of all them that looked upon her. And there was something too about, as I say, Ruth and Abigail, just to mention too, they had a characteristic that made them very pleasing. Not, shall we say, physically, but there was something in their character. And I would say the same still applies today, that ladies and men with character are often those that we would choose to be our companions and friends. We don't want people who are continually moaning and complaining about what other people don't do and things like that. When you see something that needs doing, get on with it, and the Lord will bless. But anyway, I think Haggai, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, I think he spotted something in Esther. She'd been well brought up. But sadly, there's no mention at all of any God-fearing or godliness. She'd been told not to tell about her kindred or her people. Nothing about her faith at all. And obviously when she was getting these 12 months of treatment, she wouldn't be able to control her food. And if we compare Daniel was completely different. He was brought into favour, if you remember too, as was Joseph, brought into favour. Esther, brought into favour. But I think with Esther there's a difference. There's not a single clue of godliness there in Esther, or sadly in Mordecai either. And I think, if you remember last time I mentioned that Ezra and Nehemiah were those who had answered God's call when Cyrus had given permission, but very, very few, only 50,000 or so, maybe slightly more with Ezra and Nehemiah, went back to the land, and we get what God did with them in the land. But here in Esther, we get what God is doing with those who didn't want to go back, those who had maybe chosen the Babylonish way of living and had given up a lot of the Jewish law. Daniel refused to remember to eat all the things that came from the king's table. Esther was quite happy to be indistinguishable from all those who were Persian. But this is why one of the reasons I chose that hymn to start with. God's wonderful ways in his sovereignty and his ways are just something we can't understand. We would have thought, why did he choose someone like that? But God's wisdom is not like our wisdom. He knew what she would have to put up with, not only in the harem, but also as the king's wife, marrying a Gentile. It's quite interesting how in Ruth, a Jewish man marries a Gentile lady, whereas in Esther it's the opposite way around. A Gentile marries a Jewish lady. But anyway, when we think about it, this was normal in these days. I don't believe that these conditions have any divine sanction whatsoever. In fact, the kings of Israel were told not to multiply wives and horses. But Solomon, he had 700 wives, I think that's right, and 300 concubines. So this was quite normal for the day in which these things were taking place. But anyway, 12 months preparation. It reminds me of the Jewish wedding, where Joseph was told, "Fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife," not thine espoused wife, thy wife. It was a necessity that they didn't come together for the first 12 months to make sure that Mary wasn't pregnant with someone else's child. Mary had to be married for the Lord to give birth legitimately. And here, in these days, the same, these women were not allowed to go near the king for the first 12 months. They had to have all these treatments, so-called, to prepare them for the king. And to us, it's absolutely obnoxious that a young girl should be prepared for 12 months for just possibly one night's pleasure for the king, and then disposed of to the second house, the house of the concubines. And I don't believe there's any divine approval of it. This is what sin and idolatry had brought in. But God, in his wisdom, used it because he wanted to save, as we'll find out later, God willing, he wanted to save his people Israel, even although they had forgotten him. They had apostatized from him. They hadn't taken the advantage to go back. But they're still the apple of God's eyes, as we see today. They're suffering a lot today, and they have a lot more to suffer according to Scripture. But they're still the people of God, the apple of his eye, where the Lord came from, and where the Lord, who was born a Jew, is going to reign in a day to come as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And again, it's interesting, she had a lovely character. And Esther obtained favour in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Now that's quite natural. It doesn't have to be spiritual to have a beautiful character. She'd been adopted by her cousin, Mordecai. But he was obviously a good bit older than her. And she still obeyed him, even in the house of the women. Now that obedience didn't go as far as to keep all the Jewish laws, because she shouldn't have eaten the food and so on that she was given. But she obeyed him. And that's a wonderful character. And I do believe that this was the ways of God. He had prepared someone who would fit in perfectly into that environment, because the whole object was to save his people. And Mordecai, I believe, as we'll maybe see later, was quite right, that if you don't do it, Esther, God will still, he doesn't say God, but God will still find a way of saving his people. And here we have this beautiful young girl. Now, I don't believe it was a beauty contest in that sense. They had to be beautiful. But I do believe that Ahasuerus would be looking for what we would call today a soulmate. He wouldn't just want somebody who couldn't enjoy the things that he enjoyed. And I do believe there would be a time when the maid first came in where there would be some discussion, some questions to find out what the character of these girls who came in one night at a time. But again, this man Haggai gave her special treatment. I feel convinced that the king would know that. The king would know that here was someone that his chamberlain thought very highly of. Could be wrong. But then when Esther goes in, there's no mention of her leaving and going back to the second house where the concubines were kept. She's crowned queen straight away. And we can see how God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. And it's quite striking too that when you read Scripture, I often don't pay attention to certain parts. We've all got parts of Scripture that we like. But one thing that has struck me in this book is it wasn't just 5 minutes. Between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's 4 years. And then, God willing, if we come to the next chapter, there's a good few years more. So the actual incidents in this book of Esther take place over a period of time. And but then we have the fourth feast. In 2 chapters, we're on to the fourth feast. And again, this would be a pagan feast that Esther was taking part of. And there's no mention of Esther standing out at all against it. And the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants. He'd obviously taken a real shine. I don't think the word is actually love in the original. something like he preferred her above all the others. Whether he was capable of love, some commentators are not quite sure that he loved. His main love was himself and what he wanted, but then I think a lot of the kings were like that. He made a release to the provinces. Now, we've still got these sort of traditions, don't we, where someone's given the freedom of the city and so on, and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And then verse 19 shows that this man was still gathering virgins. And it's interesting, by this time, Mordecai, verse 19, Mordecai sat in the king's gate. I wouldn't be surprised if Esther had put in a good word for him, and Mordecai had got this particular role. But again, we see God's purpose and plans behind every move in this book. The name of God may not be mentioned, but his fingerprints are over every page. So Mordecai sat in the gate. If you remember, Boaz also sat in the gate, didn't he? And Lot sat in the gate. The gate was the place where people of alleged character were there to pass judgment on problems within the city gate. So anyway, Mordecai is now sitting in the gate, but they still don't know, it's not public, the relationship or the fact that they're Jews. I believe that God was moving to make sure that there was no hitch to his plan, shall we say. These things were all divinely led. And then in verse 21 to 23, again we get another marvellous little provision of God that we don't find out until many years later, actually. When Mordecai sat at the gate, the other chamberlains didn't know of his relationship with Esther, or that he was a Jew. He kept these things quiet. And these two men had taken some, and again we don't find out even in secular history, we don't find out what their problem was. But they had access to the king because they were in charge of the access to the king at the gate of the king's palace. And they were obviously taking umbrage at something that the king had done and had bad intents for him. Mordecai passes the information to Esther, and Esther tells the king, and it's interesting, this is one situation where the king doesn't act hastily. It says, and when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out and they were hanged. And the Persians' way of hanging is not very pleasant. So we can see that Mordecai had done something, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles of the King. The wisdom of God is amazing. The more we look at these things, it's going to be quite a few years later before the facts that are raised here are brought back to our attention. And it's one of the marvelous things, the ways of God in all these books are wonderful. And it's one of the so to say, great beauties of having to speak on a chapter. You have to study it. You have to find out what the Lord has taught other people about it. And you learn things that you maybe have never learned before. Although I'm getting to the stage where, as I think I've said before, I go to make a note in my Bible and find it's already there. The memory begins to slip. But you know, it's wonderful to see in this book that unbelief has erred in, and erred in greatly, even amongst those who are the Lord's, but have difficulty with this book. It's an absolutely wonderful book of the sovereignty and wonders of ways of God in how he achieves his plans. And you know, as we look around the world today, I'm sure most of us think, Lord, why are you waiting? Lord, look how men are getting worse and worse, and the things that men are doing. But it was the same in this day. Who's not horrified to think of Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines? And these girls, it's appalling. God's thought always from the beginning was one man, one wife, for life, and that was it. That was God's thoughts. And every time that man breaks these sort of things, he reaps the consequences. And I don't believe Ahasuerus would be absolutely thrilled with the way things were going, because there was no connection. That's why he missed Vashti. There must have been a connection between him and his queen. And as we'll see later, the connection between him and Esther as a person was very, very strong. And the saddest thing is that there's no evidence, as far as I can see, and if you know of some, I'd love to hear it. There's no evidence, as far as I can see, of any godliness in these two Jews. But God had not forgotten them. And it's a wonderful thing to think that no matter what we see in Christendom today, it's hugely problematic and divided. But the church is still going to be presented to Christ, spotless, perfect, because of what Christ has done in the church, not, thankfully, what we may have done too. So that's just a few thoughts on this second chapter of Esther.